All right, well, as Whitney said in the video today, we are continuing summer at City North, and this is, if you've not been around for it, or maybe you just weren't aware, this is a very different message series for us. The messages don't really build on one another. There's no cohesive theme that ties them together. They're just kind of all one-offs, which is very fun for me, because what it means is that I can just kind of pick things that are unusual or that are interesting to me, and I don't have to try to connect those unusual things with other things. And so it's very fun for me in that regard. And today we're going to do something along those lines. I'm fascinated by odd Bible stories, or unusual Bible stories. In fact, years and years ago, I grew up Nazarene, and the Church of the Nazarene has a publishing house. And there was this one particular point in time where they put out this series of videos called Bible Stories Seldom Animated. And they were like a minute and a half long. Now, if you grew up in church in a certain era, you might remember flannel graph. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, man, you really missed out. But they were these animated flannel graph type things. And there were only 4 of them, which really broke my heart because the 4 they did were hysterical. They were like the story of Elisha calling out the bears from the woods to maul the youths. There was the one about when Peter was preaching and he preached so long that a guy fell out of a window and died. They were delightful, like amazing, hilarious videos. We're not doing one of those stories today, but today we are doing an unusual Bible story, one that you may not be familiar with because it's kind of random. We're going to be in the book of Numbers, and I'm not going to take a bunch of time to set things up. We're going to kind of just dive in because we're going to read 2 pretty significant passages. We're going to read from Numbers chapter 27 and from Numbers chapter 36, because in those 2 passages, Numbers 27 and Numbers 36, there's the story of the daughters of Zelophehad, which is just a great name. Fortunately, Zelophehad was good to us, and the 5 daughters also had great names. We're going to get to those in a minute. But the reason why this story is interesting to me is because it doesn't really seem like there's a huge reason that it needed to be included in the book of Numbers. And it's also interesting because there's 9 chapters that separate these 2 stories that each deal with the daughters of Zelophehad. And so anytime I come across a story like that, I always very intuitively am like, why is this here? Why does this narrative exist? In all the incredible things that the Bible is doing, why this? And so I'm going to try to answer that question a little bit today and make it something that we can kind of look at this obscure, odd story in the book of Exodus, which is very early on. I'm sorry, I said Exodus, I mean Numbers. That's very early on in the Bible. And we can look at it and go, well, this obscure story about these 5 daughters who lived 4,000 years ago, like what's that have to do with us? And there are things that we can learn and things that we can draw from it. So we're going to talk about the daughters of Zelophehad today. To give you some context to set up what we're about to read, at this point in the story of the Bible, God has rescued and freed his people from slavery in Egypt. He has led them through the desert, and they're kind of on the verge, on the edge of entering into the promised land that they've been waiting on for hundreds and hundreds of years. But they have to wait for some people to die first. Now, that's a different story for a different day, but the idea is that there was a generation of Israelites who were disobedient to God in the wilderness that he led them through, and so the consequence that God handed down to them was, I'm not going to bring the people into the land until this generation has passed and there's a new generation. And so we're kind of in that holding period. Israel is just outside the promised land, they're getting ready to enter, and so they're doing a bunch of administrative stuff to prepare for entering this land and organizing it and dividing it up. And so one of the things they do is they take a census. So they get all the different tribes of Israel together, and they count everybody, and they break them out into their family groups. And this is important for us. This is not something that we totally understand today, but 4,000 years ago, this was a big deal. Because inheritance, and specifically inheritance of land, was the way that your family gained status and power and significance in that culture. And frankly, it's the way you made your living because it was an agricultural society. So as they take this census, they start to break out. Well, this group of people, this tribe is going to get this land, and this family within this tribe is going to get this land, and this family is going to get this land. And so that's kind of the context. In fact, chapter 26 is all just this genealogy. And in the midst of the genealogy, there's this very random sentence about a man named Zelophehad, who it says had no sons. He only had daughters. And in the midst of the genealogy, it's kind of one of those like, why is that there? That doesn't, like, there's no need to include that. But then we get to 27 and we find out why. So Numbers chapter 27, starting in verse 1, the daughters of Zelophehad, son of Hepher, the son of Gilead, the son of Machir, the son of Manasseh, belonged to the clans of Manasseh, son of Joseph. So you can see right here, they're again establishing that family line and how they're going to divide out the inheritance. The names of the daughters, and by the way, if you're thinking about having a kid anytime soon and have a girl, here's some ideas. The names of the daughters were Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. So there you go. They came forward and stood before Moses, who is the leader of Israel at this time. They stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, who is the high priest, the leaders, and the whole assembly at the entrance to the tent of meeting. I want to pause there real quick and just make sure you understand what's happening. So we've got these 5 daughters who are the daughters of a man named Zelophehad, who a chapter earlier we found out had no sons. That detail is significant because according to Jewish law at this time, only sons could inherit land from their family. Daughters could not. And so these 5 daughters, their father has passed. As Israel's getting ready to divide out the land, these girls are going, well, this is a problem because the land that would have been allocated for our dad and our family line, there's no one to inherit it. And so they approach Moses, who's the leader of Israel. They approach the high priest, and they approach the leaders and the assembly. In other words, they go before the people to plead their case. And this is what they said. Our father died in the wilderness. He was not among Korah's followers who banded together against the Lord, but he died for his own sin and left no sons. Why should our father's name disappear from his clan because he had no son? Give us property from among our father's relatives. Now, again, let's get a little bit more context here. The daughters approach and they say, listen, we want to plead our case here. Our father has passed, and he was not among Korah's followers. Korah was a leader in the tribes of Israel who led a rebellion against God in the wilderness. So she's just clarifying, like, I know some people were following Korah, but our father was not among them. He was a stand-up guy. He didn't do what those people did. And so it wouldn't be right for his name to be removed. And see, here's the situation. And again, this is something that's a little bit hard maybe for us today to wrap our heads around, but a family's name being removed was like the ultimate consequence. It was almost seen as like if a family's name was removed from the nation of Israel, it was almost this mark on them that they were being punished for sinning against the Lord, and that they now had been removed from the family. And so this is a big deal. And the daughter's plea it's really interesting for a couple reasons. Number one, again, women could not inherit land at this point in time. And so these women are going before Moses, and they're making a plea to Moses and to the leaders of Israel, and they're saying, this isn't right. The way that this is happening right now is not right, and it's not right because our father does not deserve to be removed from the family, because functionally that's what would have happened. His name would have just been lost. And they're saying it's not right because he was a good guy, he did the right things. There's a gap here. This is unjust, this isn't right. And it's interesting too, because on the surface, it might look like the daughters are behaving in a way that is somewhat self-serving. But if you look closely at what they said, they didn't argue for land because they wanted land. They argued for land so that their father's name was not removed from the family. And so the reality is these women are coming before the leaders of Israel, and they're saying, this isn't really about us at all. But this is about doing justice by the name of our father. And we think that this is unjust. And I can't really overstate the significance of how bold of an ask this was. Israel already had an established governmental and organizational structure that had been dictated to them by God. Like, how to handle this already existed. And it was something that God had told them to do. And so in a culture where women were not seen as significant, where women could not inherit land, where women could not have all these benefits, these women coming before the leaders of Israel and saying, hold on, this isn't right, It was a significant moment. And as the story continues, what we see is that their boldness, their willingness to take a step of, frankly, pretty bold faith out of what they perceived as an injustice has really great results. Moses, in verse 5, Moses brought the case before the Lord. And this was something we see several times. There's several different cases throughout the books of Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy where there's like this gap in the law that God has given. And when that gap is recognized, the first thing Moses does is he goes to the Lord. And this is a little bit of a side note. It's not the point of today, but the idea is that Moses recognizes that the law, the rules, the restrictions, the governance, it's not his to decide what's right and wrong, it's the Lord's. The Lord gave it, and his responsibility is to go to God and ask what he should do. So he does. He goes to the Lord. Verse 6, and the Lord said to him, what Zelophehad's daughters are saying is right. That word right is an important word. In the Hebrew, it means firm or upright or dependable. It means truthful. Like God is literally saying what they are saying is full of truth. They have correctly assessed that there is a gap here. There's a hole. There is an injustice being done, and that's not okay. And so the Lord continues, and he says, you must certainly give them property as an inheritance among their father's relatives, and give their father's inheritance to them. He continues, say to the Israelites, if a man dies and leaves no son, give his inheritance to his daughter. If he has no daughter, and then God establishes a whole hierarchy here. If he has no daughter, give his inheritance to his brothers. If he has no brothers, give his inheritance to his father's brother, to his uncle. If his father had no brothers, give his inheritance to the nearest relative in his clan, that he may possess it. This is to have the force of law for the Israelites, as the Lord commanded Moses. God gives them what they want. God gives them what they ask for. God gives them what they boldly ask for because God, he says it in here, because what they ask for is just. It's truthful. Their father's name should not have to disappear from the nation of Israel just because he died and had no sons. That's not right. Now, what's interesting to me at this stage is that this might be a moment that some people struggle with biblically. Because you might look at this and you might go, well, if God's the one that established the law, and God's the one that set up all these rules, why didn't God set up this rule from the beginning? Why now is God like changing his mind because somebody asked him to? And that's a challenging question to grapple with sometimes. It's a challenging question to grapple with for a lot of reasons, but the biggest of them is if we talked this morning about how God doesn't change and he stays the same and he's dependable, but doesn't he change here? He had established the law and now he's doing something different. But I don't think that's the case. I don't think it's fair to read this as God changing. In fact, I would argue that what we see is God staying exactly the same. What I would argue is that when God established the law, God never intended to establish the law and all the rules and restrictions to cover every single use case possible for all the rest of human history. That wasn't the purpose. It wasn't the point. And in fact, I would say that, and I'm reading between the lines here to be clear, this is kind of my own take on this. I would say that God purposefully didn't cover every single scenario because God's desire, and we see this all throughout the Bible, has always been that his people will step up in boldness and seek him and request change when they see injustice. And so if God had established a perfect law that would cover every single possible thing for all of human history, there would be no need for people to step up when there are holes. And instead, what we see here is God honoring the boldness and the faith of these daughters who recognize we know the character of God, we understand the purpose of these laws, and there's something here that doesn't line up. And so we're going to go try to seek justice where there isn't justice right now. And the Lord responds favorably to it. And to be clear, it is my opinion that as I read the Bible from cover to cover and look at many stories of many people from many generations, when I think about my own life and the lives of people that I've known, it is always the case that when God's people seek him boldly, when there is injustice, he answers that favorably because the Lord is just. We talk all the time about the kindness of God, the compassion of God, the mercy of God, all these kind of things, but the Lord is also just. That is one of the key characteristics of who he is. And we often talk about justice as it relates to punishment or right versus wrong, like in terms of sin. But justice is far bigger than that. Justice is about doing the things that are in line with what is true and what is right. And the Lord always behaves in line with what is true and what is right. And so what we see here is an incredible example of there being a gap and 5 people who shouldn't have had to approach Moses, who shouldn't have had to make this request, having the boldness and the faith and the courage to say, what we know of our God misaligns with this reality we are living in. And so we are going to seek him and ask for something to change. And I would argue that it is the responsibility not just of the daughters of Zelophehad, but of Christians, followers of Jesus, God-fearing people throughout the generations to us today, to do this exact same thing, to stand in the gap when we see a gap of injustice. Now, I want to be really clear when I'm saying that, because I've hesitated over the years to talk about justice and injustice because there's some connotations to justice and injustice in our current world climate. I'm not talking about political injustice that you might hear about on the news. I'm not. It's not what I'm referring to here. What I'm saying is that when we look at this, we can see that God had an intention in the design of the organization of his people, and now there's a gap where the character and qualities of who God is and the reality of the lived experience of God's people doesn't align. And what these daughters realized is that there's no way God could be okay with this because that's not who God is. And so they're not approaching this from a political perspective. They're approaching it from knowing God, from trusting God, from believing that God is who he says he is. And they're making a plea. God, would you realign our lived reality with who you really are and your desire for your people? Now, this isn't the end of the daughters. They show up one more time a few chapters later. We don't know exactly, scholars don't know exactly how long it was between Numbers chapter 27 and Numbers 36, where we're going to look now. Most likely it was somewhere in the range of 9 months to a year. Almost certainly less than a year. But it was not an extremely long time, but some time has passed in these chapters. And as they've passed, what happens is this new law, this new rule that the Lord has established for his people, now some people are going, wait, there's holes here too. And so what we see is a repeated pattern where instead of the daughters of Zelophehad going and going before Moses, now there's some other people. There's some family heads who recognize the holes, and they're going to do a similar thing to what the daughters did. And we'll see the daughters come back in a few moments. Numbers chapter 36, the family heads of the clan of Gilead, son of Machir, the son of Manasseh, so it's the same family line, who were from the clans of the descendants of Joseph. They came and spoke before Moses and the leaders, the heads of the Israelite families. They said, when the Lord commanded my Lord, being Moses, when the Lord commanded you to give the land as an inheritance to the Israelites by lot, he ordered you to give the inheritance of our brother Zelophehad to his daughters. So they're just reminding, hey Moses, we know you cover lots of stuff. We know that you have to make decisions literally all day, every day about the future of our nation. We know you may have forgotten about the details here, so I want to remind you of what happened. And now they identify the whole. Now suppose they marry men from other Israelite tribes. Then their inheritance will be taken from our ancestral inheritance and added to that of the tribe they marry into. And so part of the inheritance allotted to us will be taken away. When the year of Jubilee for the Israelites comes, their inheritance will be added to that of the tribe into which they marry, and their property will be taken from the tribal inheritance of our ancestors. Now, again, there's kind of a lot going on here, and for us today, this is like, what? Year of Jubilee and tribal ancestral inheritance. Like, this doesn't translate exactly. But ultimately what they're getting at is that when God established this law to give the land and the inheritance to the daughters of Zelophehad, it created a new issue. Because by the rest of Israelite law, now if those women were to go and marry men from another clan or from another tribe, the tribe of Manasseh would lose the land. That's the long and short of it. Now, again, to us, it's like, okay, it's all still Israel, right? But the reality is, again, 4,000 years ago, that land staying within the tribal clan was a big deal. In fact, if you think about it a moment ago, when the daughters of Zelophehad approached Moses, the plea that they made was, our family should be able to inherit the land that was promised to them. And so the same thing is happening here. These family leaders are now coming in, they're saying, but listen, this is fine that this happened, but now the new gap is that there's a new way for us to lose the land that you gave to Zelophehad's daughters. There's now a new way that we could not have the land that you said we needed to give them. So now there's a new hole, there's a new injustice. It wouldn't be right for God to have given Zelophehad's daughters the land, but then for those daughters to go and end up giving the land to another clan. Wouldn't be right, that wouldn't be just. And so they approach Moses and they ask about it. And what we see is the same thing that happened before. Then at the Lord's command, so in other words, Moses went and sought God. Then at the Lord's command, Moses gave this order to the Israelites. What the tribe of the descendants of Joseph is saying is right. That word right in the Hebrew is the same word as a few verses earlier that we read. It means dependable, firm, upright. It means full of truth. So here again, what the daughters asked for was full of truth, and now what the family leaders are asking for is full of truth. So this is what the Lord commands for Zelophehad's daughters. They may marry anyone they please, as long as they marry within their father's tribal clan. We're going to come back to that in a minute because some of you are probably like, wait a minute. No inheritance in Israel is to pass from one tribe to another, for every Israelite shall keep their tribal inheritance of their ancestors. Every daughter who inherits land in any Israelite tribe must marry someone in her father's tribal clan, so that every Israelite will possess the inheritance of their ancestors. This was 4,000 years ago. Okay? So for all of us looking at this and going, well, that's barbaric. Kinda, because it was 4,000 years ago. But more than that, it's just. In the most literal definition, this is a just ruling. This is a just decision. The whole idea is to keep the land inside the family. Well, if there's a way for the land to leave the family, then there's an injustice happening. And although this makes zero sense to us today, and culturally and contextually, this is not prescriptive for all of time, okay? Culturally and contextually, this doesn't work for us today. That means nothing for what it meant then and what it means now. Because what we see again is the Lord acting with justice. He is doing the thing that is right. It's the right thing. Because it's the only way to ensure that God's purposes for his people are fulfilled. Because right at this point in time, God's purposes for his people is that they are to go and they are to inherit the land he promised them. And each tribe and each family clan within the tribe will receive an inheritance of that land. That has been the Lord's promise to his people for hundreds of years. And so by the Lord enacting this law, this rule, what he is doing is preserving his promise to his people. Were he to say, well, yeah, whoops, messed up, it would be unjust. And it would be unjust because now God's promises couldn't be depended upon. Now, again, when we approach the Bible, we have to understand that the Bible was written many, many, many years ago. And there has to be some level of cultural understanding of what are timeless truths and what are just realities in the way that people lived then. And again, this is not prescriptive. This is not something that we should be pursuing with our own children or our culture or our society. But for these people at this moment in time, what God was demonstrating was his justice. Any other solution to this problem and the Lord's promises can no longer be trusted. But that's not the most fascinating part. The most fascinating part is now as Zelophehad's daughters re-enter the story. Because what we saw in our reading just a moment ago from chapter 26 is we saw these daughters act with boldness, and we saw these daughters act with faith. They trusted in who God had said he was and who God had demonstrated he was through the generations. I would argue that what we see in them is an integrity, but that's reading between the lines a little bit. I would say what we see in them is character, but that's reading between the lines a little bit. But as they re-enter the story, what we see is exactly what I assumed from chapter 26. Starting in verse 10. So Zelophehad's daughters did as the Lord commanded Moses. Zelophehad's daughters, and they relist them. So here we go. Mahlah, Tirzah, Haglah, Milcah, Noah. They married their cousins on their father's side. Again, don't get hung up on that detail, okay? Okay? Yes, it's weird. It's so weird. It's 4,000 years ago. Different situation. They married within the clans of the descendants of Manasseh, son of Joseph, and their inheritance remained in their father's tribe and clan. It's weird. But what I don't want you to do is get hung up in the weirdness of that and miss the purpose. The purpose is that the writer here is clearly identifying that the daughters of Zelophehad were people of integrity and of character. They demonstrated their integrity and character in their faith and their boldness to make the ask in chapter 26, and they now demonstrate their integrity in their character through their willingness to obey what the Lord says and give up the freedom that most people throughout all of human history have desired. Because if not for this ruling, they could have married anyone from any clan in the nation of Israel. And instead, what they did was they were willing to say, we recognize that if we're going to pursue a just God, then we must also accept when he hands down rulings that are just, and we must obey them. And so they did. And that's what's so special about the daughters of Zelophehad. They were bold in their faith, but they were also obedient in their faith. They were firm in their faith, but they were humble in their faith. They were willing to go ask for justice to happen in a way that benefited them, but they were also willing to submit themselves to justice that didn't benefit them. And that kind of faith is rare because it's really, really difficult. It's easy to accept God's justice when it benefits us, but it's very, very hard to accept God's justice when it doesn't. And that's why I think the daughters of Zelophehad are included in this ancient book. I mean, I guarantee you that none of these women ever thought that people would know their names through the generations. I'm glad they're there because I like reading that list. They didn't expect that. All they were doing was trying their best to humbly obey the Lord and serve him. So there's an important implication for us through all of this. That when God acts with justice on our behalf, that is not license for us to use that for our benefit. But rather, when God acts justly on our behalf, it is now imperative that we handle that with responsibility and stewardship, honoring what the Lord has done and not just taking advantage of it. So let's bring this all together. What does this story about five sisters 4,000 years ago have to do with us? Well, I've given you some things that might apply to us, but what I haven't really said is that, quite honestly, I don't think any of that's the point of this story. I think as with most of the things in the Bible, there's a lot that you can learn, there's a lot you can see. But fundamentally, every story in the Bible is mostly about who God is. And so that's where I want to land this today. It's one of the things I like the most about the Bible. When we read these stories, we see the character and the quality of who God is. We see the way that he interacts with us. We see the human condition and the human heart, but more than that, we see the way that God works in that. So I don't think this story is fundamentally about us as people, although there's things we can learn about us as people. I think fundamentally this story is about who God is. And what we see about who God is in this story is that God listens to the bold faith of his people. He listens to us. He is moved. He is moved. The heart of God is moved by the passionate plea of his people. For some of us, I think we struggle to believe that God actually hears us at all. What we see here is that God absolutely hears, and that his heart is moved by the bold faith of his people. We also see that God is merciful and he's compassionate, but he's also just. He will do things that benefit us when it is just. And he will do things that don't benefit us when it is just. Because as soon as he breaks his justice, we can't trust him any longer. And so we can depend on it for our good, for our benefit, and sometimes in ways that don't benefit us at all. But we can trust him because he is just. And most importantly, I would say, the daughters believe this. He is constant through the generations. He is constant. He doesn't change. The plea that the daughters made, they called on what they knew of God, because they believed that the God that he was that day was the same God that he had been. The plea that the leaders of the tribes made was because they believed he was the same God that he had been. And for us, in a world that is ever changing, ever chaotic, where nothing seems to stay the same ever, it is an incredible truth that we can hold firm to a God who does not change, who is not moved, who is not shaken, who is not shaped by all of the things that happen in the world, but rather is constant, who is dependable. Because although he doesn't always do what we want, he will always do what is right. And it's interesting because as a dad, I think about that, and I don't want my kids one day to say, sorry, let me take a step back. If I had to pick one thing for my kids to say about me one day, it would not be, my dad was the nicest guy. I hope they say that I was a nice guy. A lot of days I'm not sure. But that's not my primary hope. If I could only pick one thing, I would hope that my kids would say, my dad did what was right. And even when it didn't benefit us, we knew he was going to do the right thing. And I think most of us that are parents in the room can probably identify with that on some level. We know we're going to get stuff wrong. We know we're going to yell. We know we're going to be unfair at times. But our goal, our desire, is to model for our kids that we're going to do the right thing. For those of us that are believers, I certainly hope that's the goal. I'm not always going to do what benefits you, but you can trust that I'm going to do what's right. And as much as I, as a flawed dad, aspire to that and wish that I got it right all the time and don't, I am unbelievably thankful that I can trust in a God who does get that right, who got it right 4,000 years ago and who gets it right today, who in the moments that I understand it, gets it right, and in the moments that I don't understand it, gets it right. And so what we're going to do today as we get ready to end is I'm going to have the band come. I think a couple of them are up here already, but we're going to have the band come up and we're going to sing and we're going to worship and we are going to enter God's presence and declare that truth and thank him for that truth and sing that truth loudly and proudly. That who God was yesterday is who he is today, is who he will be tomorrow, that he is the same, that he is dependable, that he was a provider, that he was a healer, that he was a sustainer then, and that he is all those things today. And so as we take a few moments and sing together and get ready to finish up the service, I would encourage you, whatever that looks like in your life, to reflect on the faithfulness of God. To reflect on the moments where perhaps God has done things that have benefited you, but also the moments where he has done things that have not. And yet how you can see in those moments that he did what was right. Because it's in God's justice that we can count on him.